So, as I was saying, yeah, if you want to prep your model for animation, you do want to make sure you have good solid edge loops. I have a couple weird issues with this mesh around the eyes, which I should fix, but for the purpose of this demonstration, this should be okay for now. So, my main point is to really get the mouth open. So I'm going to send this thing to, in this case I want to send it to 3D Max. You can also send it to Maya if you prefer Maya for mesh editing, that's totally fine. So I'll go Z this to Maya. And what I'm mainly trying to do is basically split open the mouth. I may need to do a little bit of mesh cleanup. In this case, just get a nice straight line across the mouth opening. Close that guy. Okay, so yeah, in this case what I'm going to do is just clean up the mesh fairly quickly, I hope. Don't have too much to do in this case. So I'm going to just, I could do this in Symmetry, but I'm going to try to work a little more quickly than that. I'm going to turn on ignore back facing. So I want to just get a nice solid line here. So I'm going to connect and collapse this area here because it looks like it can make a nice solid line for me. So connect and collapse that. Connect and collapse. There we go. Like I said, there are some edge flow issues here. I'm not crazy about this edge flowing in here the way it does, this edge flowing here, but I don't want to deal with that specifically in this lecture, so that's something that could be dealt with later on. What I do want to do is grab this edge loop and go out to roughly where the corners of the mouth should basically terminate. So this would be right the outer edge of the lips, let's say. I think possibly going out to here. Let me just double check that. All right, so by the way, I'm noticing something else as well. Sometimes when you create mesh in ZBrush, sometimes you sculpt and you don't realize where your mesh is facing. In this case, if I go to a front view and look at this character, I'm facing the back of the character's head. So as a general rule, what I would actually do is I'm going to reset max. I'm going to go back to ZBrush. I would prefer to have this thing oriented properly all the way through. So I know this thing is actually facing backwards, and you can also use the floor in ZBrush to see where the thing is located at least. So at least I know it's facing upwards in the right direction, but it's backwards. So I need to rotate this thing 180 degrees. Now the problem occurs when you have a character that has a lot of subtools. It's very complicated. So the easiest fix for this is to go into Z plugin, and then we go down to Transpose Master. So what Transpose Master allows you to do basically is it creates what's called a Tipos Mesh. Now this can get a little bit buggy if your mesh is not clean, if things are masked, or if things are hidden. It can get really, really strange. So before entering that mode, I usually control click and drag to make sure there's no mask, and I'll do this for each and every subtool. In this case, I believe I have multiple subtools that I don't need. So this second set of eyeballs, I'm going to actually just delete those because I want the ones that are clean. And as out of sheer paranoia, I also tend to do this as well. I will go to Modify Topology, and I'll go to Optimize Points. So what that basically does is it lightens the, it basically reorders. So you may or may not realize this, but in 3D, each and every vertex gets a number or a label. So that's how the software knows where everything is. So one vertex may be number 1, other vertex might be 5020, another one will be 382. And as you cut and paste and change the mesh and remesh and dynamesh and all that stuff, those points can have wildly different numbers from one vertex to the next. So optimizing points is actually a really, really effective and useful thing to do. And there's something else I'll often do as well, which is go to Mesh Integrity. I'll go to Check Mesh, and then I'll say Fix Mesh. Just, again, out of paranoia, I don't want things to bug out on me, especially at this stage. When you're nearing production quality, you don't want things to blow up on you. So what can happen with particularly mesh that you need for blend shapes. Blend shapes are very sensitive to the vertex naming and ordering or numbering, as well as the mesh layout. So if there's any little bugs and you fix those bugs, the problem is you may destroy your blend shapes afterwards, which means you have to redo all the blend shapes. So you want to try to clean the mesh and make sure it is as production ready as possible. So again, I'll do the same process. I'll go to optimize points. Now this model has subdivisions, and a lot of these functions don't like to work on models with different subdivisions. So you will in fact need to freeze them temporarily. So go to your low subdivision, freeze them, go to optimize points, mesh integrity, check mesh, fix mesh, and then unfreeze. Now hopefully when you unfreeze, nothing changes. It just brings back the high poly sculpting detail. But it's not something you can always guarantee. It's trying real hard right now. Okay, so it's back. I'm going to clear the mask again. Go back down to my lowest subdivision level, because this is the level I want to work at. And now I would go back in and go to transpose mesh. So what you're going to do is hit Tipos Mesh or transpose mesh. What that allows you to do is make quick rotations, scale changes, movement, position changes, and it collapses everything down to one subtool, which allows you to make these major changes very easily. So I'm just simply going to go to deformation. I'll go to rotate. In this case, rotate on Z is not what I want. So I'm going to very carefully turn off Z and go to Y. I believe that's the correct axis. And then I'll rotate 180 degrees evenly. And then I can go back to Z plugin. And I'll say go from Tipos Mesh or transpose mesh back to subtools. So it brings back all the subtools, applies the transform changes, and turns it around the correct way. So this is, again, a good thing to do if your character's been modeled or sculpted in the wrong position or facing the wrong way. Also, if you want to make major pose changes to an overall character, let's say it's got a character with a jacket, a hat, all this stuff, it's a very quick way to tilt the head, rotate the arm, and put it into a position. So that transpose tool is very good for posing characters in ZBrush as well. So I'll go Z this thing back to max, and if I hit F for front view, right, this thing should be facing me, which it is. So that's good. Good sign. So I'm going to go in. You could do this in Symmetry, but again, I have very, very minor fixes to do, so I'm not going to bother going through that. But I will be careful to select specifically the vertices I want to fix. I'm going to go connect first, which then allows me to collapse them together. And then I'll grab this edge loop here. By the way, if you control click, so control click grabs a second edge. If you control double click, it grabs a whole loop. So in this case, I can do that very quickly to grab this little edge here. So what I want to do is go in. I'm simply going to hit split. So what split does is it does exactly what it says it does. It splits these edges into two. So if I grab, let's say, just one of these edges and pull it down or pull it up, you can now see there's a split in the lip. One thing you may also encounter, this may happen in Max or Maya, you see when you have objects that are very small, like ZBrush's working scale is actually quite tiny, and so it's very difficult to zoom in. You'll want to look for this in Maya if you're working in Maya as well. It's got the same kind of label, set up a little bit differently, of course, but if in Max you go to perspective and viewport clipping, this is basically the range at which the camera cuts off the visibility of an object. And the lower, it sort of puts this yellow bar on the side. And if I drop this lower notch down, I should be able to zoom in much, much closer to the object without it kind of cutting off the mesh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the loop function. Again, it's a little bit problematic because the edge flow here is a little bit rough. So yeah, maybe I'll just leave this one edge. I'm going to pull that one edge up just a touch. So in this case, I would probably fix weird mesh flow issues right now. So I'd go in and connect this down here and connect this down here. And then I can sort of tidy up these edges right here. So I get a bit of a cleaner flow going into the mouth there. And again, I'll try to grab the correct edge here. So pull this up. I just want a little bit of a gap so I can see what I'm doing. In this case, I may now go back in and I'll do the symmetry function. So I'll just grab this half of the mesh. I'll delete it. Again, I have to be very careful about not selecting too much, not leaving anything behind. So I'll zoom in. Again, because this thing coming in from ZBrush is a very small scale object. So when I do a symmetry as well, what symmetry does in Max is it kind of welds things together. Excuse me. It welds things together. And that's based on this size threshold. So I'm going to need to turn that down to 0 and then slowly dial it up. And actually you can see here that threshold is so low, and this object, because it's so small, it's still welding back the vertex from the lip. So I want these things to be just far enough so that they don't snap together. Okay. So the next phase for basically creating the mouth opening is quite simple. Again, I want to grab the border of that opening. So let me change my cage color as well so it's a little easier to see. So I'm going to grab that opening, and quite simply, I'm going to hold Shift, pull it back. Now, what I often tend to do as well is I like to see this. So this kind of forms like the border of the lip, essentially. The inside border, I should say, or inside edge of the lip. So I'll tend to deselect either the bottom or top edge and leave a corner edge deselected so I can pull this up a little bit and start to see the beginning of a kind of mouth cavity shape, right? Because that's what we're building, is a mouth cavity for animation purposes. So I'm going to pull this thing down just a touch. Then I'll double click it to grab the loop. I'll hold Shift and I'll scale vertically on the Z axis and pull this back just a bit. Okay. Again, this can get kind of complex to see or to look at. So what I often start to do is simplify the mesh down. So if I'm looking at this inside edge, what I usually will do is grab two adjacent edges on a loop, and I'll collapse that, and then I'll take out the middle edge left in between, if you guys can see that. So it allows me to kind of simplify down and reduce down the mesh, especially because the interior cavity does not need to be super elaborate or complex. And simplifying it now will make the rest of the job a lot easier. And I'll try to leave the corner as is. There we go. Collapse that and take out this edge here. And then I'll leave the rest for simplifying once I do another extrusion or two. So yeah, I'll grab this edge now. Might be a little more complicated to grab because I've messed with the flow a bit, but there we go. So this kind of forms that imaginary interior border. If you want to straighten things out too, sometimes I'll do this. I'll just go make planar. So I'll go make planar. In this case, it should be on Z. Oops, let me close that. So I'll go make planar on Z, and it'll straighten the line out a little bit. So it just makes things a little bit neater. Do the same thing over here, make planar on Z. So I'm going to Shift and scale upwards again and pull this back. So this will start to form the bulk of the mouth cavity here. So Shift and scale upwards on Z and then pull this thing back. Okay, so we're kind of creating an area for gums and teeth to reside in. So again, I might even scale this up quite a bit larger. Just be careful that it doesn't intersect or poke through the front side of the lips there. And then what you can do is Shift and move back. Again, if you need to change the shape, you can do that quite easily. At this point, just grab an edge, pull it around. And that's one of the benefits of having that simplified cage, is that it's easy now to make this shape. And I can also do, let's say, make planar, I guess, on Y. There we go. Create a nice kind of even shape there. Hold Shift, drag it back again. And then maybe Shift and scale down. I'll have to move this inwards so it syncs up well to the center axis. And then you can, if you really want to get elaborate, you can kind of create a little, oops, expand that there. Shift and rotate, and then you can have kind of the extrusion down into the esophagus, basically. Right, so there's your kind of proto mouth cavity. So it's a place for you to put, like I said, your teeth, your gums, tongue. You only really need to add that stuff. You know, you can actually get away with a lot of cartoon characters having no teeth and no tongue, especially if you're not doing any lip sync. So that stuff is actually quite optional in cartoony characters, but in human sort of semi-realistic to realistic characters, they tend to need teeth and possibly a tongue as well. So just try to be aware of what your kind of end product is going to be, and make sure that your mesh is suitably set up for that. The other thing is, if this thing is going to be rendered at a subdivision, you want to sort of see what it's going to look like with Turbo Smooth. Okay, so the mouth right now is kind of slightly open. And also there's a bit of weird turbo smoothing happening in the corner. Again, this is a bit of a topology issue. So, you know, I could clean it up now. I should have actually cleaned that up before I extruded, but I'm not going to deal with topology at this point, or at least not in terms of cleaning it up. What I do want to do, though, is maybe do a very quick unwrap. So don't be afraid, but I'm just going to go to unwrap UVW. And what I want to do is create some basic UVs. They don't even have to be totally clean. I just want the UVs there so that I can use... ZBrush has a great function for creating polygroups based on UVs. So I'm going to basically go grab the mouth. I'm going to expand this by hitting the little grow selection option in the UV editor until it basically reaches the probably this edge or maybe this edge here of the lips. So I'm going to grow this out. Yeah, I think to about there. So go into the UV editor, and these, like I said, these don't need to be clean UVs. They don't need to be good or pretty UVs. They just need to be, you know, pretty vague ideas. So what I did there is I basically went to what's called the pelt mapper under peel. And so I hit peel, and then I went to start pelt and stop pelt right here. You can relax it if you want. I usually don't even do that anymore. I just say commit. And if you really want a more like properly laid out UV, you can go to quick peel afterwards, and it should give you something that's low distortion. But again, I'm not totally focused on making sure the UVs are super clean. I basically want the UVs just so I can create polygroups out of them. So I'm going to go into edge mode next, and I'll go to the loop function here. So that's right here under UVs. Hit that edge. So in this case, that goes right up to the ear, which is pretty close to, I think, where I want to be, but I'm going to deselect a few edges. And I use this peel section a lot when I do UVs, so I'm going to convert the edge selection to basically blue map seams. So you'll see that'll turn blue. And then if I wanted to, I could also go, let's go F5 again, I guess. Yeah, F5. I'll go point-to-point seams. So what that allows me to do is just click on a vertex and go vertex to vertex, and you see it'll kind of create this isolated seam here. So I can kind of quickly get the jaw selected. So what I'll do next is I'll turn off this seams, point-to-point seams mode. Go to poly mode, and if I pick one poly, by the way, if you can't see these blue seams, it's because there's two types of seams that display. One type shows you the outer edge of any particular UV island. That'll show up in green. You can turn that off and only see peel seams, which is part of this menu here. So that's turning off map seams and only leaving peel seams visible. So what I'll do is I'll grab a poly within that area, and then I'll go to expand polygon selection to seams. So it'll go all the way out to that kind of lower jaw area. I'll simply go pelt, start pelt, stop pelt. I could do a relax if I want. Again, it's not necessarily a bad UV layout either, but I'm mainly doing this strictly for quick poly grouping inside of ZBrush. So I don't even need to properly unwrap the rest of the head. I can just take all this stuff, go down to arrange elements in the UV editor, and say pack. I usually do pack normalize out of habit. Actually, let's make sure everything's in there. Pack normalize. All right. And I'll send this back to ZBrush. So go Z, edit in ZBrush. It says the topology of the mesh has changed. Do you want to transfer the high resolution detail? So it detects that I've got new UVs, I've got new polygon layout, and that I have high poly detail still in my Z tool. So the great thing about this is I can quickly just say, yes, transfer my sculpting detail to this new laid out version of the mesh. In this case, I didn't really do any detail sculpting at the high res. I just have subdivisions, but and yeah, sometimes this can happen. You can get a bloody mess. So you do want to be a little bit careful about transferring details. Let me go back here. So I'll go Z this back in. I'm going to say no this time. So the eyeballs for some reason are still facing backwards. So I'm going to grab these eyeballs, and I'm going to go to deformation. I'll do the rotation thing again. Let's see, we're rotating on the right axis. There we go. So now everything's facing the right way. Oh, and I should have made sure. That is probably part of my problem here. Let me undo this a bit. When I go Z back, you got to be careful. So I was sort of sitting at this UV level below symmetry. You want to make sure you're at the top level of the model before you send it back. And if you want to be extra paranoid, there's a couple of things you can do. You can go to what's called an STL check modifier. What this thing will do, and I'm going to just activate the check function here, it's going to go through the mesh and check for errors. In this case, I think the only errors I have are the open edges. So I can verify that by going back in to open edge. And if I get the same number of errors, then I know it's just the edge issue. So right now, this looks fine to me. I'm going to delete that STL check, and I'm going to go Z, edit in ZBrush. This time I'm going to say yes to transferring detail because I should get the model the way I wanted it to be posed. Because I wasn't bringing, last time I was bringing in only half the head instead of the full head. Still giving me a god-awful mess, so I guess I'm going to have to say no to the... try one more time. No to the transfer. This is why having your mesh properly oriented is a good idea. Checking it early is a good idea. If you have this problem and bringing the model back in is a problem, just leave it in its bad orientation and fix it after you transferred the head back in. That can sometimes fix things. The eyeballs, again, I'll fix by doing that rotation change that I made earlier. So I'll go to rotate. There we go. You just slide right into position there. Okay, so this thing has its subdivisions. So as I was saying, we see a couple of polygroups here as well. I've got one polygroup for the eyes, which unfortunately I'm probably going to lose. But if I go back down into the polygroups menu, I can go UV groups. As soon as I hit UV groups, or maybe I'll try auto groups with UVs. Yeah, auto groups with UVs will work better in this case. So what it's actually done is recognized the different UV islands. And now I've got these three pieces quickly and easily accessible. So this is a really great setup, like I said, for when you want to open the mouth. So you can go to, let's say, the rotate tool, control click on the jaw, and then I'll control tap once, maybe twice. And now, if I go into rotate, so let me go back and set this up for, here, I'll turn on my subdivisions. I'll go back to layers. So now I can go about creating my blend shapes, right, with a mouth cavity this time. So that's the basic process of going through and creating a mouth cavity and then getting it kind of ready for animation purposes there. Now in this case there is a bit of a weirdness because I think I should have maybe made the lip a little bit more accessible, right? So let me go back into Max. I'll show you how I can fix this actually fairly quickly. Go back to the unwrap here. I'm going to go to This option, by the way, down here, it allows you to select whole islands or elements very quickly. So I'm going to grab the mouth cavity. And what I'll do is I'll shrink the mouth cavity down. So I'll try to maybe shrink it down using the shrink selection option. So that way I have a little bit more of the lip available to the mouth itself. So I'll go and just do a quick, I guess, pelt on that. Commit that. And then I guess this part here, let me go to, I guess this is the lower jaw here, right? So I'll go in and just quickly add this sort of lip portion here to that piece. Actually, I can deselect this part. And I'm going to right click and break this off. Again, the UVs don't need to be like clean or good necessarily. They just need to be kind of functional enough for this. So where am I selecting this here? So I'm just trying to find the actual lip of the edge of the lip. So I'm going to grab these edges right here. That's perfect. And then I can right click and go to stitch selected, right? And that'll basically attach that lip. Again, it's not a clean unwrap. You know, if you want to be fully production ready, then you can really spend a lot of time on this. But yeah, I'm just going to weld this little floating piece, weld that edge back over to the head here, stitch selected. I do want them packed well though, just so that they each occupy their own little space. That way it's easy for ZBrush to read and split these things apart, right? So if I go Z this back, again, make sure I'm on the top level here. It's one thing I would change about that script. Okay, so you see it's reset the polygroups, right? So I just simply have to go back to polygroups, and in this case I'll go auto groups with UVs, and you see it now changes that mouth cavity. So the good thing is I now have a portion of the lip that's maybe going to be a little bit easier for me to quickly go in and kind of mask and hopefully get a better kind of blending result in terms of rotation. So rotations usually for jaws occur from the opening, just out of the opening of the ear, if you're talking about a human or humanoid character, and then we can kind of pull this down like so. One thing I do recommend too, what you might want to do is to, I'll switch back to draw mode for a second, and I'm going to just remove maybe a portion of the mask here in the corner of the mouth. I do want to still isolate the upper lips, but because there's a bit more motion. Sorry, I should actually add a bit to the mask and then just blur this a little bit. So, oops, go to draw mode, bring this down just a touch, and then blur this. And I may also want to make sure that I'm not unmasking any other parts. There we go. So I'll hold Shift to align that tool so it's nice and straight, because if I didn't and I drag this out, it would have a weird pivot when we rotate this jaw. So hold Shift, and then I can pull this down. There, we get a much more natural blend actually in this case by kind of pulling the mask down just a touch. Now, you're looking right through the back here for two reasons. I didn't curve the back of the mouth down enough, and you're seeing through the back side of the head as well, right? So if I went to display properties and went to double-sided, you'd see the back of the interior mesh of the head. It's like very blow-up doll at this point, right? But yeah. Anyway, so this is on an active layer, right? This is one thing that drives me nuts about ZBrush's menus is that, like, it's so easy to get lost. They should be alphabetically labeled here. Here, I'll call this jaw open for now. All right, so if you need to, you can go in with, as I mentioned earlier, you can kind of use an inflate brush to maybe inflate the area under here. Because this tissue kind of has to go somewhere. You can soften it back, which is what I usually do, and then I'll kind of inflate it a bit. So that way, if I turn off record now, you'll see this kind of natural blend in, right? And kind of puffing and puckering in that opening. What we should see, I don't have teeth, unfortunately. You should have teeth as a reference. Oh, this is a strange one. I've had this bug occur to me a few times, and I got to figure out how to...
Oh, man.
Yeah, this really sucks. Sorry, I'm going to have to go to standard brush, go to RGB, or maybe MRGB, and I'll go to color fill object. Now let me clear the mask, color fill object. This is, I don't know, this is something that is really terrible in ZBrush right now. It's a very bizarre bug. Yeah, like I said, my high-res sculpt isn't really, it's kind of non-existent, so it doesn't really look that great, the lips either, but the lips should, actually the corner should pull down a bit, and the upper lip should pull down a bit over whatever teeth and gums are there. In this case, I don't have any. And we should also sink in the cheeks a bit. Again, remember that there are some teeth and gums, so you want to maintain a shape here and here that kind of mimics that. Even in a cartoony character, I think it's useful to do that. So let's bring this down a bit. Just to get a more kind of organic looking opening. Yeah, and the cheekbone seems to be kind of expanding in a weird... so yeah, we can pull that cheekbone back up. Now, the other thing you can do as well, I mentioned this earlier, so let's say you're making one specific blend shape and that blend shape is being really bizarre. You can go back to morph target, store the morph target of the character in its default pose. So sometimes you can do this. You can start with the character with its lips closed. You can start with the character with its mouth half open, and then you can have an extreme open and then a true mouth closed. For me, I often start with the lips closed, but that can present problems in terms of grabbing mesh. But my workaround, as I said, is that UV trick that I use and polygroups, right? So what I've done is I've stored a morph target of the character in its default pose or default face. And now if I go back to recording, right, I can now go back to brush, and there's the morph brush. And I could say, well, let's, actually going to make sure this is actively recording, right? Let's morph this stuff back in properly up here, you know? Or if I go, let's say, to a low intensity, I can kind of get a more gradual blend. Okay, so it's not so crazy and extreme and deforming, right? There's a bit more of a natural positioning happening there. Yeah. Well, the morph brush kind of creates a snapshot of the model in one state, and when you use the morph brush, so let's say, for example, excuse me, I'm going to make a another target just to show you. So I'm going to create a new. I don't know why. I have to find out what the answer to this is, but this happens a lot in certain files. What I'm going to try to do, sorry to fix this, I'll go back to standard brush, turn on MRGB. Set my color to white, and go to flat color. I'll go to document, go to color, fill object. Again, I got to make sure masking is cleared. I think when you start layers with masking involved, it can get kind of bizarre. So I'm going to clear the mask, fill the object. By the way, when you fill a ZBrush model with a flat colored material and a white color, you should be then able to freely jump back to other materials without having to load them through the color palette anymore. But anyways, I have to figure out why ZBrush does this sometimes with layers, where it just fills it with this really horrible color, black color. Sorry, so yes, to come back to this, why or what does morph target do? So let's say I want to create blinks, right? If I do it in Symmetry, again, this is going to be really bad, so don't pay attention to this as an example for good blinks. Like I said, this is really, really awful. Okay, so this is, I mean, the eyelids here are badly defined anyways, so I wouldn't get a good blink if I tried, but, okay, so let's say this is our blink, right? Ah, again, why? Why ZBrush? Okay, so we got our blink. Well, what I can do is that while the mesh is in this current state, I can grab a snapshot of it. It's really what it should be called. It should be called snapshot. So I'm going to delete the previous one that was there, delete morph target. I'm going to store the current eyelid state, okay? And then if I go back to layers, and if I turn this layer off, and I create a new layer, again, ZBrush being totally bizarre. I don't know why. No, it's I have to. I'm gonna have to Google this because I forget why the problem occurs, but it's completely stupid. Ugh. Why? No. Anyways, okay, so back to my regular color here. If I go back to morph. Right? I'm going to turn off symmetry. Well, because I stored that blink and I have the I'm using the morph brush now, right? So the morph brush is active. Current brush, morph. What's going to happen is wherever I brush, it's going to bring back that morph target. So now I can do 1/2 of the face. Right? Does that make sense? So it makes it very easy. So I've done the 1/2. I'm going to turn off record, turn this back to 0. I'm going to clear any mask just in case. I'm going to create a new morph target. Again, it's going to be a weird ZBrush. Why? Color, fill object, just to clear the stupid thing. So we go back to morph brush. Oh, no. No. I don't know. It's just bugging out. I painted color. Yeah, I painted color and material here by accident. So let me just undo that. So I'm going to go back to the morph brush. I was using standard brush, which is what I was using to reset my colors. So I'm going to go back to morph. So I've got another morph target. So now I can do left and right blink independently, right? And that's all because I grabbed a snapshot of the brush or a morph target. Right, so using morph targets is a good way to fix blend shapes that look a little weird, or to split a symmetrical blend shape into 2 halves. Because sometimes you want to smile on one side or the other side. So I usually start by building a symmetrical morph target, a symmetrical layer, and then I create a morph target of that, and I can do a half smile on the left and the right side, right? So it becomes very easy to start to break up the symmetry of the face and facial expressions for animation. So I hope that helps you guys.